What's one family saying or phrase you heard growing up that still sticks with you?
You're not bringing a date, right? That's how it started. Not with a genuine conversation. Not with curiosity or warmth. Not even a fake, sugar-coated version of sisterly concern. Just that 7 words, spit out like she was swatting a fly. It was a Tuesday afternoon, sometime around 3. I was sitting in my car outside a client's office, eating a cold salad with a plastic fork, catching 10 minutes of peace between meetings. And then my phone rang. I saw her name flash on the screen and, God help me, I smiled. I actually smiled. Because no matter how distant we'd grown, some idiotic part of me still thought maybe this time she was calling to ask how I was doing, or to invite me out for a drink, or to say she missed me and wasn't sure why we'd ended up on different sides of the fence. But no. Instead, I got, "You're not bringing a date, right?" I remember the moment exactly. My heart did this weird flutter, not the good kind, but the kind where your body knows before your mind catches up that something isn't right. I paused, my fork hovering midair. I didn't answer right away, and that silence, those few seconds, must have made her nervous, because she rushed in to fill the gap. I just mean, it's gonna be mostly family and close friends. I don't want things getting, weird. And obviously Ryan's got a lot on his mind already. I just want the day to be about us. Us. That word landed like a slap. It took everything in me not to laugh, because what she meant by weird was uncomfortable, and what she meant by us was her. Madison had always had a talent for pretending that her feelings were universal truths, that everyone else's discomfort was a threat to her own happiness, and that anyone who dared complicate her narrative was being selfish. But let me back up for a second. Because I need you to understand why her asking me not to bring a date wasn't just petty. It wasn't just her usual controlling behavior. It was war, dressed up like a phone call. See, 3 years ago, I was dating someone. A man. Ryan. He was kind, solid, nothing flashy, but for the first time in a long time, I felt seen. We met at a charity gala in Chicago, of all places. He was managing logistics for the event, and I was doing consulting for the nonprofit behind it. It wasn't love at first sight, but it grew. Slowly. Naturally. And then, one weekend, he came home with me for Thanksgiving. That's where he met Madison. And 2 months later, he ghosted me. No warning. No fight. Just silence. One week we were picking out curtain rods for his new condo, and the next, I was staring at my phone like an idiot, rereading old texts and convincing myself he must have been in a car accident or abducted or developed sudden onset amnesia. Anything but the truth. It wasn't until 6 months later that the truth walked into my mother's backyard, wearing a floral romper and holding hands with him. I still remember that barbecue like it was yesterday. Madison had this smug little grin on her face, like the cat that not only ate the canary, but also installed a security camera so she could replay it later for her friends. Ryan wouldn't even meet my eyes. My mother said nothing. And, just like that, the whole family decided to treat it like a minor misunderstanding, like maybe I hadn't been that serious with him after all, or maybe I was just being sensitive, or maybe I should grow up and be happy for them. So, when Madison called me that Tuesday and told me not to bring a date to their wedding, what she was really saying was, stay small. Don't make a scene. Let me be the star. Again. I didn't respond. I just sat there, staring through the windshield at a strip mall, watching some kid on a skateboard weave through traffic like he didn't have a single care in the world. Madison kept talking, rambling now, saying something about dress code and seating charts and how tight the guest list was, but I wasn't listening anymore. Because in that moment, something shifted. Maybe it was the months I'd spent in therapy trying to process the betrayal. Maybe it was the way she hadn't even bothered to fake remorse. Maybe it was the years of being the reliable one, the smart one, the one who made sacrifices while Madison got to chase whatever shiny thing she wanted. Or maybe I was just done pretending that taking the high road had done me a damn bit of good. Because I did have a date. Her name was Clara. And no, Madison had never met her. But she'd definitely heard of her. Most people in our city had. Clara was the CEO of a massive logistics company. Confident, successful, and exactly the kind of woman you notice when she walks into a room, not because she's trying to be flashy, but because she couldn't blend in if she tried. We'd been seeing each other for almost a year. Quietly. Carefully. Mostly because I wasn't ready to open that door to my family yet. Not after everything. But suddenly, I wanted to open it. Wide. Not out of pride. Not even out of love. Out of rage. So, no, I didn't argue with Madison. I didn't tell her how wrong she was or how ridiculous her requests sounded. I didn't defend myself or my relationship. I just said, sure. I'll see you there. Then I hung up. And I stared at my reflection in the rearview mirror. And I smiled. Because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't playing by their rules. And this time, I wasn't going to be the one left picking up the pieces. But tell me something, what would you have done in my place? Played nice, or burned it all down? The rehearsal dinner was held at one of those places that tries too hard to look effortless, the kind of overpriced vineyard that markets itself as rustic chic with strings of Edison bulbs exposed with beams, and vintage wine barrels stacked strategically in corners, as if you might forget that you're 20 minutes from a shopping mall and a Cracker Barrel. The parking lot alone was a parade of overachieving SUVs and least luxury sedans, and as we pulled in, Clara reached over without looking and placed her hand gently on my knee. It was a quiet touch, subtle but grounding, and I realized I hadn't taken a full breath since we left the city. It was strange. I wasn't nervous the way you get before a big meeting or a first date. This was something heavier, slower, like dread mixed with adrenaline, like standing on a cliff edge, knowing the jump was inevitable, but also knowing you were the one who climbed up there in the first place. Clara, as always, was calm. She didn't fidget. She didn't check her phone or reapply her lipstick. She just sat there, serene in her black silk dress, sipping still water from a reusable bottle, waiting for me to open the car door and take the first step. We were early by exactly 7 minutes. On purpose. I wanted time to walk in, to be seen, to give Madison just enough notice to feel the ground shift beneath her heels before she had a chance to fake a smile or adjust her mask. As we approached the entrance, I could already see heads turning, first curious, then surprised, then downright uncomfortable. Not because we were a same-sex couple. This wasn't the 1990s, and even my conservative Uncle Dave had learned how to say partner without flinching. No, the shock was about who Clara was. The whispering started before we even reached the welcome table, and by the time we stepped into the courtyard, it was undeniable. Madison had no idea Clara was my date, and Ryan had no idea that his boss was mine. The first person to greet us was a woman I vaguely remembered from high school, now wearing a name tag and a forced grin. Her eyes darted from Clara's face to mine and back again, and when she handed me the name card for table 3, her fingers were visibly trembling. I thanked her with a polite smile, then took Clara's arm and walked straight into the mouth of the beast. Madison saw us before we reached her. She was standing near the fountain, surrounded by her bridesmaids and one of our cousins, holding a champagne flute with her signature too-perfect posture, the kind of poise that photographs well but never looked natural in real life. When our eyes met, I watched her expression shift, first confusion, then recognition, and finally, something deeper. Panic, maybe. Or the realization that she had just lost control of the evening before the party had even started. She took a single step forward, as if to intercept us, but then stopped. Ryan, bless his oblivious heart, hadn't noticed us yet. He was at the bar, laughing too loudly, the kind of laugh that always struck me as just a few notes off from sincere, like someone performing joy instead of feeling it. Clara, ever the diplomat, leaned toward me and whispered, "Should I go introduce myself, or are we enjoying the slow burn?" I almost laughed. Almost. But instead, I whispered back, "Let them come to us." And they did. Eventually. After 15 minutes of pointed stares and awkward half-smiles from Madison's entourage, Ryan finally looked our way. I saw his brow furrow, his mouth part slightly, and then, like someone hit a switch, his whole body stiffened. He took one hesitant step forward, then two, and by the time he reached us, His voice was low, tight, and completely devoid of the fake charm he usually smeared over everything like cheap cologne. "Emily," he said, nodding stiffly. "Didn't expect to see you here so early." "Funny," I replied, tilting my head slightly. "I was invited." "Don't people usually show up when they're invited?" His jaw clenched. He glanced at Clara, then did a double take, and I could almost see the gears turning in his head. Recognition was slow but irreversible. "You're Clara Harper," he said, more a breath than a sentence. "You're the CEO of Westline Logistics." "Yes," Clara said, extending her hand with the same calm grace she used in boardrooms. "Nice to finally meet you, Ryan." "I've heard so much." Ryan looked like he'd swallowed a shot glass. He didn't shake her hand. Just stood there, blinking, clearly calculating how badly this might unravel and how fast. Madison finally approached, her eyes flaring with a look I hadn't seen since we were teenagers, and I beat her to the lead role in a school play, Controlled Fury, wrapped in a smile. "Emily," she said, wrapping her arms around me with the stiffest hug known to mankind, her voice sugary and bright enough to give you cavities. "You made it." "Of course," I said, returning the hug with just enough pressure to make her skin crawl. "I wouldn't miss your big day." She pulled back and turned to Clara, clearly trying to regroup. "And you brought." "This is my fiancé," I said, before Clara could answer. Clara. The word fiancé was intentional. Not girlfriend. Not partner. Fiancé. A title that implied permanence, commitment, and, most importantly, family. The color drained from Madison's face, slowly, like someone pulling the plug on a neon sign. "I didn't realize you were engaged," she said, her voice dry. "Well, I figured if we made it to a year without anyone ghosting or sleeping with my sister, it was a good sign." Clara didn't flinch. Ryan swallowed hard. Madison smiled so tightly it looked like her teeth might snap. There was a long silence. Then Clara, ever the queen of grace under pressure, leaned slightly toward Ryan and said in a voice that could have frozen lava, "We should chat on Monday. I've been meaning to talk about your team's Q3 numbers anyway." And, just like that, the air changed. Not with shouting. Not with chaos. But with quiet, heavy recognition that something had shifted beneath their feet and they were no longer on steady ground. We stayed for the rest of the dinner, of course. We were polite. We clinked glasses. We even danced a little. But every eye in the room kept coming back to us, not because we were making a scene, but because we had become the scene. And while Madison smiled through the evening and Ryan tried desperately to blend into the crowd, I sat back and watched the two of them squirm because for once, I wasn't the one hiding. I was the one holding the spotlight. And tomorrow, during the wedding, I plan to shine it a little brighter. There's something oddly theatrical about weddings, something that goes far beyond the obvious choreography of the vows, the speeches, the carefully curated decor and coordinated bridal party outfits. Beneath all that pageantry, there's this strange undercurrent of tension, like everyone's pretending this is the happiest day of someone's life, when in reality it's more like a live performance with too many moving parts, too many unspoken grudges, and just enough alcohol to loosen the wrong tongues. And I knew, the second I walked into the vineyard's main hall for the ceremony itself, that today would be no exception. Madison had spared no expense. The ceremony space was wrapped in blush linens and draped eucalyptus, with gold-accented chairs arranged in neat little rows like obedient soldiers ready to witness the merging of two lives that had already been entangled in ways neither of them dared say out loud. The air smelled like a mix of perfume, fresh flowers, and desperation. Everyone looked impeccable. Everyone smiled too wide. Everyone avoided looking directly at Clara and me. Which was fine, because I wasn't there for them anyway. The ceremony itself was short, efficient, and devoid of surprises. Madison wore a custom gown that fit her like a glove, of course, and Ryan looked like he'd been carved out of one of those catalog ads where everyone's drinking sparkling water and pretending they've never had an awkward conversation in their life. The officiant droned on about commitment and partnership and honesty, and I watched Madison's lips curl slightly every time she glanced toward Ryan, that same smug little twist that said, "Look what I took from you." But the truth is, she hadn't taken anything. Not anymore. And she had no idea what was coming. The real show, the one I'd been carefully and methodically preparing in my head since that phone call, didn't begin until hours later, during the reception. By the time everyone had found their way into the reception hall, this massive converted barn with chandeliers made of wine bottles and long wooden tables dotted with overpriced wildflower arrangements, the tension had softened slightly. People were drunk enough to relax, just enough to forget there had been a metaphorical grenade dropped the night before. Clara and I were seated at table 3 again, this time strategically placed halfway between the bridal party and the dance floor, close enough to feel important, but not so close as to provoke a direct confrontation. Not yet, anyway. Dinner came and went. Speeches began, first the best man, a childhood friend of Ryan's who made the usual jokes about college parties and bad haircuts, followed by the maid of honor, one of Madison's college roommates who cried a little too easily and clearly hadn't practiced her speech beyond the phrase, "She's just always been there for me." I watched Madison's face the entire time. Her cheeks ached from forced smiling. Her eyes kept darting toward Clara. She was waiting for the other shoe to drop, but she couldn't quite figure out where it would come from or when. And then, just as the servers were beginning to clear the plates and the DJ was preparing to ease into the first dance set, I stood up and picked up my glass. No one had asked me to make a toast. That was the beauty of it. The clinking of my spoon against the side of the champagne flute cut through the room like a blade, silencing conversations in waves. People turned, unsure whether to expect something sentimental or scandalous, and Madison's face, oh, God, her face froze into a kind of brittle alertness, the way a deer does when it hears the snap of a twig in the woods. I raised my glass just slightly, enough to make it clear I wasn't going to let this be some casual moment, then I began. "I wasn't planning on speaking tonight," I said, letting the silence wrap around my words like velvet, "but weddings have a way of stirring up old memories, don't they? They bring out the best in us, and sometimes the most revealing parts, too." A soft chuckle moved through the crowd. Clara's hand rested on my thigh under the table, not to stop me, but to let me know she was there, that I could go as far as I wanted, and she would follow me right off the edge if that's where this went. I went on. "When Madison and I were little, she used to copy everything I did. The same haircut. The same music. Once, when we were in high school, I even caught her practicing my signature, and when I asked her why, she said, 'Because your life always seems cooler than mine.' And you know what? That's fair. I worked hard. I made mistakes. I built things. But Madison, she has always known how to curate things. How to take what looks best and make it hers." There were a few stiff laughs, mostly from people who hadn't known us long enough to read between the lines. I caught Ryan shifting uncomfortably. Clara didn't move. "And now," I said, "she's done what she does best. She's put together something beautiful. This day, this dress, this life. It's impressive. Honestly, it's inspiring. It makes you wonder how much of it came from her, and how much she borrowed along the way." Silence again. Heavier now. The kind that asks, "Did she just say that?" I turned toward Ryan. Not fully. Just enough to make sure he knew the next part was for him. "I hope you both find happiness," I said, voice steady, tone soft, because real happiness doesn't come from taking what doesn't belong to you. It comes from building something real with someone who sees you, not just the version of you that looks good in pictures, but the messy, complicated, real you. Then I smiled. Warm, poised, perfectly controlled. To Madison and Ryan, I said, "May your borrowed dreams hold up better than your borrowed truths." I sipped. The glass was half full. I set it down slowly. And I sat. No one clapped. They didn't need to. It was enough. Madison didn't move for a full 10 seconds. Ryan's eyes were locked on the table. The tension radiated from them like heat off a cracked engine. And just when I thought it couldn't get any better, Clara leaned slightly toward Ryan, just enough so that only a few nearby tables could hear, and said, with a crisp smile and eyes like steel, "We'll talk on Monday. I have some concerns about your team's ethics." Ryan didn't respond. He couldn't. And that was the moment I knew. The trap had sprung. The mask had cracked. And tomorrow's headlines might still be full of wedding hashtags and filtered joy, but tonight belonged to me. Because some toasts bless a marriage, and others begin its slow unraveling. There's a strange kind of silence that falls over a reception hall after the last toast has been given and the music starts up again, the kind of hollow quiet that settles between people when words have landed heavier than expected, and for all the spinning lights, the clicking of heels, and the dull clatter of champagne flutes being reset by staff, you can feel a pressure in the room, thick and slow, like humidity before a summer thunderstorm. I didn't need to look around to know I'd created a disturbance. I could feel it in the way no one met my eyes, in the way the laughter became thinner, in the way Madison had disappeared somewhere between my last syllable and the DJ's awkward transition into a Motown classic meant to reset the mood. Clara remained composed, as she always did, one leg elegantly crossed over the other, sipping slowly from her wine glass like nothing out of the ordinary had just happened. As though that little surgical strike of mine had merely been a moment of light-hearted sibling banter and not the carefully calculated, deeply personal scalpel I had wielded with the precision of someone who had waited years to be seen, to be heard, and more than anything, to make them feel what they had once made me. Carry in silence. Eventually, I excused myself from the table. Clara nodded, understanding I needed to walk through the fire alone for a moment. I could already guess where Madison had gone. She was always predictable when her image cracked, always retreating to mirrors and bathrooms and corners of the world where she could reassemble herself behind closed doors. Far from the pitying looks and whispered judgments of people she so desperately wanted to impress. So I headed toward the back hallway of the venue, past the kitchen entrance and into the private corridor where the restrooms and bridal suite were tucked away from the main event. I pushed open the heavy oak door to the women's room and wasn't surprised to find her there, standing in front of the mirror with both hands braced against the edge of the sink, her shoulders locked tight. Her makeup still intact but her posture betraying the panic just beneath the surface. She didn't look at me when I entered. She didn't need to. She knew it was me, the way only a sister knows, by the air we carry, by the weight of our footsteps, by the kind of silence that follows us into a room. "Why?" she asked, her voice thin, as if speaking too loudly might cause her carefully constructed face to splinter. "Why would you do that here, now?" I leaned against the wall, arms folded, my tone far too calm for what she clearly expected. "You mean tell the truth?" She turned, slowly, and for the first time that day, I saw something real behind her eyes, fear, maybe, or just the deep, gnawing recognition that things had finally shifted, that whatever dominance she'd held over me all these years had begun to erode in real time. Not because I was trying to tear her down, but because I'd finally stopped letting her stand on my back. "You humiliated me," she said, each word stiff, like it had been pulled from a script she'd memorized a long time ago, in front of our entire family, in front of my husband's colleagues. "In front of your husband's boss," I interrupted, and she flinched. She stared at me for a long moment, lips parted, eyes searching mine like she was looking for some version of me she still recognized, some fragment of the sister she used to control, to manipulate, to outshine, but I wasn't offering that version anymore. "You know what's funny?" I said, not smiling. "You could have told me the truth 3 years ago. You could have called me, sat me down, said, 'Emily, I'm sorry, this is going to hurt, but I fell in love with him.' I wouldn't have liked it. I would have been furious. But at least it would have been honest." She scoffed and turned back to the mirror, adjusting her earring, avoiding my reflection. "It wasn't like that." "No?" I asked, walking closer now, not to intimidate her, but because I needed her to hear every word without escape. "Then what was it like, Madison? Because from where I'm standing, it looks a lot like you watched me get gutted by someone I loved and decided to benefit from the aftermath. And the worst part? You didn't just take him. You let everyone else act like I was being dramatic, like I was imagining things, like I should just be happy for you." Her silence was answer enough. I stepped around her then, faced the mirror too, and for a long, quiet moment, we stood side by side, two women wearing similar eyes, different lives, the same blood but entirely different hearts. I could see her trying to compose herself, could almost hear the wheels spinning in her head, how to frame this, how to turn it back on me, how to salvage whatever was left of her wedding day narrative. "What do you want from me?" she finally asked, her voice a mixture of exhaustion and exasperation, like I was the problem child throwing a tantrum in a room full of guests. I looked her dead in the eye, not blinking. "I want you to feel it," I said. "I want you to feel what it's like to be an afterthought. An inconvenience. A ghost at your own sister's celebration. I want you to stop pretending that just because you got the flowers and the dress and the man, that you somehow came out clean." She blinked rapidly, jaw tight, as if my words were sandpaper grinding against her pride. But she didn't cry. Madison never cried in front of people. That would imply vulnerability. Instead, she straightened her back, adjusted the neckline of her gown, and said, with brittle confidence, "You're not better than me, Emily. You never were." I nodded slowly, as if accepting a sad truth. "No, but I'm not less than you either." And with that, I turned and walked out, leaving her with her perfect reflection and her rotting fairy tale. As I returned to the main hall, I passed our mother in the corridor, standing stiffly near the entrance like a statue planted to keep watch over the proceedings. Her eyes flicked toward me, sharp and unreadable, the same way they always had when she wasn't sure which daughter to support, or more truthfully, when she already had and just didn't want to admit it out loud. "You couldn't let her have this one day?" she asked, her voice low but laced with that familiar undertone of accusation. I paused, met her gaze. "She had every day," I said, cold and steady. "This one was mine." And then I walked back into the lights, into the music, into the mess I'd created, not with guilt or shame, but with the kind of clarity that only comes when you finally stopped asking for someone else's permission to exist. Because Madison may have gotten the aisle and the applause, but I got something far more honest, the truth, spoken out loud, in a room full of people who never expected me to speak at all. And for the first time in years, I felt free. Mornings after events like that never feel the way you think they will. There's no triumphant music playing in the background, no sense of overwhelming relief. No cinematic fade out with a satisfying smirk on your face as you watch the world finally tip in your favor. There's just silence, the kind that hums a little too loudly in your ears, and an odd stillness in the air that feels heavier than rest, but not quite like peace. When I woke up that morning, sunlight already slicing through the hotel curtains in narrow, blinding beams, I could feel the weight of everything that had happened the night before pressing against my chest, not as regret, but as proof that something irreversible had taken place, something that couldn't be smoothed over or walked back or neatly repackaged for the sake of family harmony. Clara was already awake, sitting on the corner chaise with a mug of tea in her hands and her reading glasses perched low on her nose, the way she always wore them when she wasn't in a rush to perform authority but was still very much in control. She looked up when I stirred, her eyes calm, lips tilted into a knowing half-smile that didn't require words. She didn't say, "How do you feel?" or "Are you okay?" because she already knew that the answer would have been complicated and likely not what either of us wanted to start the day with. Instead, she said, "Ryan texted me at 4 in the morning." I raised an eyebrow, sitting up slowly, feeling the stiffness in my back from a night spent tossing in a bed that wasn't mine, in a town that no longer felt like it had room for me. "Anything useful?" I asked, though I wasn't sure if I cared. Clara took a slow sip of tea, then set it down. "He said he was sorry. Said he didn't know. Said he hoped I wouldn't hold your little speech against him." "Did he call it little?" I asked, a bitter chuckle escaping before I could stop it. Clara smiled again, this time wider. "His words, not mine." I swung my legs over the edge of the bed and stared at the floor for a moment, letting the quiet settle. The truth was, I didn't feel like I'd won anything. There was no sense of victory, no endorphin rush, no swelling pride at having delivered the final blow. What I felt mostly was hollow. Not empty, exactly, but scraped out, like I'd finally said everything I'd carried for years, but hadn't yet figured out what to do with the space it left behind. "So," I said after a while, "is he fired?" Clara raised her eyebrows, paused, and then offered a noncommittal shrug, the kind that meant she'd already made a decision, but wasn't going to say it out loud until the paperwork was signed. Let's just say I've been looking for an excuse to restructure his department. Last night made the timing ideal. It wasn't petty. It wasn't even personal. It was strategic. Clara had always understood that in business, as in life, people reveal themselves most clearly when they think no one is watching. Ryan had shown her who he was years ago when he ghosted me, again when he started dating Madison, and now once more in the way he tried to quietly distance himself from consequences that had finally, and rightfully, found him. I showered slowly, letting the hot water run too long, letting the steam fill every corner of the room like I could somehow wash off the years of restraint I had forced myself to wear like armor. When I stepped out and caught my reflection in the mirror, I barely recognized myself, not because I looked different, but because I felt, for the first time in a very long time, like I had taken up space without apology. Clara and I checked out quietly. The front desk clerk didn't meet my eyes. Word had spread, no doubt. There's always someone live streaming, always someone gossiping in the coat room. I could imagine how the narrative had twisted overnight. Some would call it brave, others cruel, and plenty would insist I had ruined my sister's wedding just to settle an old score. But the truth was more complicated than that, and I wasn't interested in simplifying it for the comfort of people who had never once asked what it cost me to stay silent all these years. As we drove back toward the city, past the familiar suburban exits, strip malls, and school zones that marked the edges of the world I had outgrown, Clara reached over and squeezed my hand, not because I needed comfort, but because she knew I would never ask for it, and she wanted to offer it anyway. I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. When we got back to her apartment, technically ours now, though I still hadn't fully moved in, there was a letter waiting on the kitchen counter. I recognized the handwriting instantly, even though it had been years since I'd seen it on anything other than Christmas tags or birthday cards. It was from my mother. I stared at the envelope for a long moment before finally picking it up. I knew opening it meant stepping back into the war zone I had just walked away from, but curiosity won out. Inside, on a cream-colored note card with gold foil trim, was a short message written in her delicate, slanted script. Emily, I'm sorry if things have been hard between you and Madison. I know you both see things differently. I only ever wanted peace in the family. I hope, in time, you'll come to understand why I stayed out of it. Love, Mom. I read it 3 times. No real apology. No acknowledgement of what happened. Just vague gestures at both sides, as if the wound was symmetrical, as if the theft of trust and love and dignity could be washed away with mutual misunderstanding. I folded the card, slid it back into the envelope, and dropped it in the trash without a word. Because the truth is, some bridges don't burn. Some bridges are never built. The following Monday, I stepped into Clara's office not as her date or her shadow or the sister of her employee, but as her newest executive hire, Senior Director of Strategy and Communications. It was a role I had earned, long before any of this unfolded, but the timing made it feel almost poetic. I sat across from her in a conference room overlooking the skyline, and she handed me the company badge with a quiet kind of pride that didn't need to be spoken. You ready for this? She asked, not with doubt, but with the kind of challenge that meant she already knew the answer. I nodded. More than ever. I didn't know if I'd ever speak to Madison again. I didn't know if Ryan would land somewhere else, or if my mother would ever say the words I needed to hear. What I did know, sitting in that office, wearing a tailored blazer and finally breathing fully, was that I hadn't burned down my past for revenge. I had done it to build something that looked like a future. Still, as I sat in that leather chair, watching the city bustle below, a quiet ache curled at the edges of my chest. Because for all the strength and fire it had taken to reclaim myself, there was still that single photograph buried somewhere in a drawer, a snapshot of Madison and me as little girls, arms wrapped around each other in cheap matching pajamas, grinning like nothing in the world could pull us apart. And I couldn't help but wonder, just for a second, did she ever really love me? Or had I always been the placeholder until she could take what she thought I didn't deserve? I'll probably never know. And maybe that's the cost of choosing truth over harmony. Maybe that's what real power tastes like. Not victory, but clarity.